Shall I start? Welcome. I'm Reed Lipset, a research scholar on the faculty of the Yale School of the Environment and one of the co-leads of the Network for the Digital Economy and the Environment. Increasing digitalization of our economy and the dramatic development of artificial intelligence have produced rapid growth of data centers and an attendant increase in demand for electricity. This in turn has engendered debate and concern about the adequacy of energy supply and the contribution of data centers to greenhouse gas emissions. This has prompted national and international research and policy attention. Local environmental impacts arising from the growth of data centers, including air pollution, water consumption, and land use, despite expanding press coverage, have not been extensively explored. To take just one example, in reviews of academic research literature, only a very small handful of studies of local environmental impacts of data centers were found. Thus, this webinar has been organized by the Network for the Digital Economy and the Environment and hosted by the Environmental Law Institute to increase understanding of the local environmental issues related to data center proliferation. We focus on Northern Virginia. For the non-US members of the audience, Virginia is the state just south of Washington, D.C., because of the density and increase in the number of data centers there. Next slide, please. So let me say something about the Network for the Digital Economy and the Environment. It's an initiative jointly of the Environmental Law Institute, the Yale School of the Environment, and the University of California, Berkeley. And the goal is to catalyze and disseminate research on the environmental impacts of the digital economy and to bridge, and now especially to bridge the gap between research findings and their translation into policy. The network has been around since 2018, and it's supported by the Internet Society Foundation, the U.S. National Science Foundation, and the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. And it hosts a research coordination network, has developed an extensive bibliography, funded research on these topics, and has an inventory of environmental applications of blockchain. Let me turn to today. Next slide, please. So today we've assembled a very impressive group of experts on the topic of local impacts. We're going to start with, we'll start with a brief presentation by our panelists and then give them an opportunity to respond to or elaborate on each other's contributions. We'll then take questions from the audience. Please put your questions in the chat function of the Zoom, and we will, one of our team will record those and pass them on to the panelists. So we're going to start with Pravanna Rapala, who will provide an introduction to the growth in data centers in the US. That will be followed by Professor Amy Stern, who will give a quick overview of the energy situation related to data centers. Professor Lauren Bridges will discuss the local environmental impacts as related to water, and Jim McElfish will describe emerging trends regarding approaches that local governments are taking regarding land use regulations and other considerations relating to siting of data centers. And then we'll open, the panelists will respond to each other, and then we'll turn to the Q&A. So let me turn this over now to Pravanna Rapala, please.
Everyone, my name is Pranav Parla. I am a Presidential Innovation Fellow with the U.S. Department of Energy. I'm split between the Office of Policy, where I focus more on supporting our data center engagement team at the DOE to help promote the growth of data centers in the U.S. and powered by clean energy, and making sure that it's built with community input in mind and ensuring that we're not passing those additional costs on to other ratepayers and communities. And then in my other capacity, I'm also working on using AI tools to help deploy more clean energy that can then build more tools that can help us permit and site faster to deploy more clean energy so we can support more growth of clean energy technologies. So today I'm just going to introduce a little bit about some of the stats and numbers of where data center load growth has been in the US, and then share a little bit about the department's approach to this and what we have coming next. So on the next slide, have a little bit of like load growth by the numbers. And basically, last year, data centers were around 4% of total US electricity demand, and is projected to grow to 9% of total US electricity demand. So not only is it growing in general, it's also growing as an increasing share of all electricity demand growth in the US, and about 15 to 20% projected over the next decade. This demand is a little bit unprecedented, but we've had load growth spikes in the past. And the way we've approached it is with technological advancements, energy efficiency, and in some ways, like decreasing certain industrial processes too. So in the past, we've met the challenges, and today we think we have the tools also to meet the challenges. We have more tools with both financial, technical resources, and broader industry partnerships and engagements to figure out how to build these in the right places and with clean energy in mind in the US. And so on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about some of what we've been doing recently. So a lot of data centers are not new. They've been around for a while, and large load facilities have been around for a while. So what's kind of new, I would say, is in 2024, we had a lot more engagements with data center developers, utilities, state local officials, community organizations, and other stakeholders. And we've just been trying to get a lay of the land of what are the different challenges folks are facing with building. There are some communities where there's lots of data centers, and they're sort of encroaching upon communities that are being built next to where people might not necessarily want them. There's also other challenges where there's certain communities and locations where data centers would be a good fit, but it's harder to build there. So we've been trying to get a lay of the land by talking to all these stakeholders. And then in the summer, we published at energy.gov/electricity demand, we published a bunch of our resources to help build data centers and other large load facilities in the US. A lot of these include actually specifically state technical assistance for state and local officials so they can study the problem in their particular regions, also for utilities so they can study the problem in their regions and then get support to figure out how to build in the right place with all of the stakeholder and community input in mind. And we've been convening further with the industry this fall. I would say one of the things to highlight would be in September, the White House held a convening with the Department of Energy and the Department of Commerce on critical AI infrastructure. And while we're thinking about load growth in general across electrification of vehicles, manufacturing, more onshoring of manufacturing, also with more data center load growth, the priority for the administration coming out of that convening was focusing on building domestically all of the pieces that are critical for AI infrastructure. So that's manufacturing chips and silicon that go into data centers in the US, especially through the CHIPS Act. And that also includes making sure that the data centers, which are going to be training the next generation of models, are built domestically in the US. And that's a national security concern, a priority as well. And part of the other challenges that are coming out of that, which we've held a few workshops for, are thinking about how we can get flexible, like with flexible loads for AI training and how we can deal with that with the industry. We've also had a couple of workshops with our around nuclear with Idaho National Lab as another way to have carbon-free opportunities and high baseload power. We've also had with our FECM office, which is fossil energy and carbon management, thinking about how we can build more capacity within existing energy assets. And we've also been showing up at a lot of the convenings hosted by industry partners and state and local and community partners. And what's coming up next that we have, it will be later this month, we'll have a report from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab on data center load growth through 2027. So just more data to just assess where we are today, both as a share of total demand and as a share of growth in particular regions and sectors. And then we're also spending a little bit more time researching tariffs and rate design. And this is really important because as we build more data centers, as we build more energy generation, we want to make sure that those costs are appropriately shared and that we're not passing them back on to everyday people and ratepayers and communities, and that whoever is looking for these data centers is paying the share for what they need. So that's an overall view of like what we've been doing. And on the next slide, I'll just share a couple of highlights of what are our solution areas to kind of support so that we can build. So number one is we want to revitalize existing infrastructure. There's a lot of what we call energy communities across the US where we have retired or retiring assets. So retired or retiring coal plants, even nuclear plants, other manufacturing facilities. And these are important because they are interconnected to the grid. They have the communities are hungry for some development. And there also is a lot of infrastructure in place on site that can be used to build a new data center or build a new clean energy generation. So our Pacific Northwest National Lab has published a lot of resources around converting retired or retiring coal assets to new technology. So to nuclear, to geothermal, to solar and wind with on-site storage. And we have a lot of push around that. And that's a deep partnership with communities to make sure that the right solution fits their needs. Another couple ones that I'll highlight, a lot of the behind the meter flexibility. Talked a little bit about the load, about the workshop that we held around that with one of our labs, but also a lot of these data centers will come with a lot more of their own generation on site. So they're not going, some of it will have to come from the grid, but a lot will be bring your own power to your solution. So there's a lot of investments in that space. I mentioned a little bit, we have a paper coming on rate and regulatory designs. That's a really important one. And then also just committing to what are the long-term technologies we need, not just in the next few years, but as we look to 5, 10, 15 years out, as we see even more growth in data centers for AI and other cloud growth, we need more of these technologies across the board. So a lot of those take planning and investment today so that they're realized and available in 10 years from now. Some of the resources that we think, one last thing I'll just point out before we pop on, some of the resources that I want to highlight on the previous slide are, I talked a little bit about coal redevelopment, but another one is around building more clean energy generation on DOE lands. So that basically, we have a lot of federal lands, especially sites where there are data centers, or sorry, sites where there are national labs, and there's tons of opportunity to build solar, to build wind, to build nuclear on these lands. So we're spending a lot of time thinking about how to put that to use to increase capacity for the grid. And they're usually large sites. And some of these are up to 80,000 or 90,000 acres. And so not all these will go to data centers. Some of these will go back to the grid to decarbonize the grid as well. And so the last plug I'll put there is, if you want to connect with us and reach out to us, then businesshub@hq.doe.gov. This is the central point for our data center engagement team, which has representation from all across the DOE. So you don't have to know about what office to engage with. We have one place of contact and we'll get in touch with you. And so I'm excited for the conversation today.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's move on to Amy Stein, not Amy Stern. Sorry about that, Amy.
No worries. Thank you so much, Reed. So good afternoon. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. I'm Amy Stein. I'm the Cohn Wagner Professor of Law at the University of Florida Levin College of Law. And I'm going to spend my short time introducing you to some of the key energy and climate implications of data centers. Before we can understand the energy implications, I think we first need to get an understanding of our electricity profile for the United States, just more generally. So if we were all together in the classroom, I would start by asking you all, what resource powers the largest portion of the electric grid in the United States? I would get some blank stares, just like I see blank Zoom boxes. I would get some fossil fuel gases, some solar and wind. But as many of you already know, first slide, please. The answer is natural gas. As a nation, we are almost 40% dependent on natural gas. You may also know that coal was a historical leader for decades until 2016, when our fracking shale revolution pushed it out. But this handy electric outlet from the U.S. Energy Information Administration provides us with a lot of other useful information for today's discussion. I'll draw your attention to just 4 other facts. 1, renewables have come a long way. I have been teaching energy law for 15 years now, practiced for a decade before that, and renewables used to be a barely perceptible thin green line. Now they've reached almost 1/5 of our electricity supply. Fact number 2, nuclear also provides almost 1/5 of our electricity supply. It has remained relatively constant over the years. And this segment is becoming increasingly relevant to data center discussions, as many of you may have seen with things like Microsoft's recent power purchase agreement with Constellation Energy to restart the 3 Mile Island's Unit 1 reactor. Point 3, despite all the press around solar, wind provides 3 times as much electricity for the nation, which you would see in that little pull-out box to the left there. And 4, just want you to note oil's role in our electric grid. Can anybody find it? It is almost non-existent. So when we talk about energy, it's useful to keep in mind that there are 2 primary sectors: the electrification side, electricity, and the transportation side. And oil dominates transportation discussions, but provides less than 1% of the nation's electricity. But it is also important to note that this national outlook does not reflect the wide diversity in sources that vary by region across the United States. And because today's focus is on local impacts, advance next slide, please. This snapshot from Energy Information Administration provides you a little flavor of this variety. The Energy Information Administration tallied renewable generation over the last decade by region. You can study these more closely afterwards. I know they may be small, but you can see that as of 2023, the Northwest Rockies and California are in the lead there in the first breakout chart, followed closely behind by the middle swath of the country, with a shout out to New York for also beating the national average there on the third chart. Now, this is consistent with the wide variation in natural resources around the country. Think the Pacific Northwest and all of its hydropower. It's also consistent with wide variation in various state and local laws incentivizing renewables. Think about California and other states with their 100% clean energy mandates, and other factors that shape each state's unique electricity profile. If you're interested in the rate of growth, the middle of the country wins, with Texas on an enormous boom in both wind and solar. It is showing the fastest, their electricity consumption is growing fastest there. And local impacts will differ depending on the choices that each state makes to respond to this projected growth. Obviously, a natural gas plant has different environmental impacts on a local community than a wind farm. And so if you're interested in more of this, I would encourage you to check out EIA's state-by-state electricity profiles. But this is all important because as data centers, and particularly hyperscalers, look to set up shop, availability of sufficient electricity is one of many important factors they will consider. Now, as Pranava has indicated, all predictions are pointing to growing demand from data centers. Lawrence Berkeley National Labs actually completed a study in 2016 on data center electricity use, looking at servers, storage, network equipment, and infrastructure over a 20-year period. And in 2014, data centers in the US consumed an estimated 70 billion kilowatt hours, representing 1.8% of total US electricity consumption. But current projections tell a different story from their estimates, for they had estimated back then that by 2020, we were only going to be at maybe 73 billion kilowatt hours. But as Pranava has just shown us, right, we're already at 4% of total US electricity demand. We also, I'm sure you're seeing it all over your news feeds as well. Electric Power Research Institute recently predicted data centers could consume 9% of electricity by 2030. Pranava's chart confirmed that. Grid Strategy says a 16% surge over the next 5 years, 90 gigawatts by 2029. I like to keep my eye on utility IRPs, their integrated resource plans. Last year, Dominion Energy's IRP predicted a quadrupling of demand in the next 15 years. I mean, these are some eye-popping numbers, and that make many people skeptical. Forecasts are notoriously temperamental and elusive. And it's important to know that not all data centers are alike in their electricity needs. They vary drastically in size and scope and purpose, whether they're co-located or not. And data centers are just part of this growing demand story that we're seeing. There's more demand coming from EVs, crypto, just general efforts around the country to promote electrification. The International Energy Agency predicts that electricity consumption from data centers, AI, and crypto is expected to double by 2026. But if we see a growth in AI dedicated data centers, for instance, we might see a large portion of that dedicated to things like generative AI, ChatGPT, that you might be using with more frequency. Researchers are pointing to that the GPUs that you use in generative AI as being 10 to 15 times more electricity intensive than traditional CPU processing. Goldman Sachs research estimates that data center power demand will grow 160% by 2030. So we're not sure about the estimates, but one thing is pretty clear: the demand for electricity to fuel data centers is going to be greater in the future than it is today. And the growth is going to be differentiated across different localities. Next slide, please. For instance, here we see the Energy Information Administration's tracking of actual, not projected, commercial electricity demand by state over the past 5 years. Electricity use is usually divided into 3 categories: residential use, think about you and me, heating and cooling; industrial use, think manufacturing; and commercial use, thinking businesses and governments. EIA has conveniently color-coded the U.S. commercial demand here, with those in blue showing the largest increase in demand and those in yellow reflecting the largest decreases in demand. Now, you look at this, and do they line up nicely with, parts of the country that are trying to enhance renewables that we just looked at? Maybe yes, maybe no. Do they line up nicely with, data center growth? Maybe yes, maybe no. Advance next slide, please. When they show this data in the bar chart form, you see that there are 2 outliers, Virginia and Texas, 2 states that are leading the way in data center development. Electricity demand has grown the most in Virginia, which added 14 billion kilowatt hours over this period, adding almost 100 new data centers. Texas is close behind, but then, you sort of see some interesting states next in line: South Carolina, Arizona, North Dakota. But maybe they're interesting because of the news that we're seeing. Like Duke just announced agreements with big tech for clean energy deployment in the Carolinas. North Dakota, EIA attributes their large computing facilities to their growth. Are these going to be the next data center hubs? We're not sure, but we can see that there are many factors that come into play in decisions about where to site and where electricity demand is occurring. My fellow panelists are going to speak about some other reasons why data center developers are drawn to different areas, including tax incentives and local zoning regulations. But with my time, I'll throw in one additional constraint on these data center developers: their own carbon goals. Because, of course, the carbon footprint of each of these data centers will be dependent on the local electricity profile for the utility that serves them. In 2022, for example, Virginia's electricity supply relied on 54% natural gas, 31% nuclear, and 11% renewables. And, next slide, please. Big tech is becoming this key player now in energy as well. By big tech, I'm referring to Amazon, Microsoft, Alphabet/Google, Meta, and Apple. Each of them publishes an annual sustainability report, and each has made pledges, just like this one. Microsoft will be carbon negative by 2030. Some say carbon neutral, some say carbon negative. There's a lot of discussion about these sorts of pledges. Next slide, please. Amazon says they're going to take till 2040, but they've also committed to a net zero carbon emissions plan. But when you think about it, these goals are not that far away now, right? The 2030 pledges, that's in about, 3 weeks. It's going to be, right, just 5 years to achieve these. So what can we do? Advance next slide, please. We're starting to see a lot of news articles like this. Big tech is the nuclear industry's new best friend. Amazon, Microsoft, and Google rush to sign deals. Many of them are looking to nuclear to solve their problems of needing a lot of electricity in a short period of time. It's a baseload source. But the last nuclear reactors were built in Georgia, the Vogtle units 3 and 4. They took 15 years to build and cost over $36 billion. That was more than twice the projected timeline and cost. And that is going to be difficult to achieve in 5 years. And that's part of why Pranava's revitalization of existing infrastructure is so important. And some of the research we need to do is identifying those sites that are already interconnected. Because climate impacts also need to be considered when deciding where to site the next wave of data centers. Lawrence Berkeley National Labs released a report last year on the drought and extreme heat impacts to data centers in Northern California. More of such work is needed to remind us the importance of including climate projections into data center design and planning. Advance next slide, please. And if big tech sticks to their carbon commitments, this means finding not only abundant and cheap electricity, but carbon-free electricity as well. Department of Energy released this handy guide for future research. I think it's just nice to remind us areas to address to think about how we can meet these needs, thinking about both generation, transmission, energy efficiency, and then thinking about ways the data centers efficiencies and flexibility can be used. Servers are improving, in their power scaling abilities, reducing real power draw during idle periods or when they're at low use. And these efficiencies point is really important because I think very often we slip into thinking that we can only address electricity needs by building more power plants. Demand side initiatives that shift times of use and enhance efficiencies can also help. So building upon DOE's good work, with my last few minutes remaining, I'll just throw out a couple of potential research areas. Because even if all those projected demands is real, the real constraint may come from the supply side. Because there's a real question as to whether generation and transmission infrastructure will be able to keep pace with such demand at this speed. So things to think about. One, how to achieve meaningful permit reform to get electricity infrastructure completed. Two, how to resolve the very long interconnection queues across the nation. We're starting to think about self-supply, as you may have followed with the recent FERC rejection of the Amazon Talon co-location deal. So I know that Tim is going to discuss some equity concerns, but making sure we think about equity across different service classes in electricity. What happens if electricity costs skyrocket? How do we make sure residential customers are not subsidizing data center customers? Thinking about regulatory needs to refine new nuclear construction for both traditional and small modular reactors. How will electric utilities behave in this transition? They stand to make a lot of money if data centers kind of need all that extra electricity. What should be the role of local state regulators, PUCs and PSCs in the transition? What's the role for the RTOs and the ISOs, and how will those regions with competitive markets differ from those in traditionally regulated markets? How can we enhance the efficacy of policies related to local environmental, economic, and social impacts with so many varied stakeholders? That's just a little food for thought for later. And I thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to our discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Amy. So let's move on to our next speaker, Professor Bridges.
Hi, everyone, and thank you to the two previous speakers. You've outlined all of the core issues, especially around power. I'm going to be jumping off of those points and speaking about water today. So my name's Lauren Bridges. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Virginia in Media Studies. And water and power are actually pretty entangled at this stage with data centers. And that's because evaporative cooling is still the industry standard way to cool servers. And it's one of the cheapest ways and most convenient. And this method uses a lot of water. So advance next slide, please. Globally, data centers are forecasted to consume around 450 million gallons of water daily by 2030. And this is up from 205 million in 2026. These trajectories look somewhat linear between power and water because of this relationship between cooling and that water is used in the cooling process. However, there's lots of variation around water usage. As Dr. Stein already mentioned, not all data centers are built the same, and the water usage also will depend on the location and the climate of that location. And the other major issue is that there are significant gaps in the data. So there's a lack of transparency, and as researchers, we don't have access to the most recent and to industry standard consumption patterns. So, for example, in 2022, a survey by a company called Uptime found that only 39% of data center operators are actually measuring their water usage. Most operators said that they weren't tracking water usage because they say there was no business justification for that, which suggests that it's a low priority for management. And hopefully that will change with some of the legislation that's coming down the pike and increased, community pressure. But at the moment, there is just a lack of data and a lack of transparency. So all of this water usage has been increasing in intensity with the boom in AI. A study published in 2021 estimated that a single ChatGPT request consumes the equivalent of a 500 ml bottle of water. But just a few weeks ago, the authors of this study warned that their original water calculation was based on the OpenAI figures from 2020. And so instead, they've already revised this paper to say that it will actually be 4 times as much for ChatGPT 4. And this is because that the servers that are built for AI and the chips that are used for AI have much more power density and greater cooling demands. And that's just going to increase as these models get more sophisticated over time. But it's also important to note that water usage in data centers is also not distributed equally. It's concentrated in development hotspots. So, for example, in Northern Virginia, data center water usage has increased by almost 2/3 since 2019. And that's in the context of increased susceptibility in the region to droughts. Okay, next slide, please. So one of the important things, both as an educator and as someone that speaks on this topic frequently, I find is that we need to have common language to discuss these different impacts. And there's language that's proposed and used by industry, and it's important for us to understand what these terms are. So there are different ways that water is consumed or used in data centers. So there's direct at the site of water at the site of data centers themselves. We might think of this in terms of so for example, the greenhouse gas protocol uses the terms scope 1, 2, and 3 to talk about direct, indirect usage, and usage in the supply chain, further in the tech supply chain. So scope 1 refers to direct usage at the site. So this includes water mostly used for cooling, but it also involves water used for other building purposes. And according to a professor at Texas Tech University, who's a director of the Water Resources Center, Professor Udamary, he says that the typical data center uses anywhere between 3 and 5 million gallons of water per day, or the equivalent of water that would be needed for a city for 30,000 to 50,000 people. And while many data center operators are using gray water, most of them, the research shows that most of them are still relying on potable water, so our drinking water as well. This is particularly alarming because almost 1/5 of data center water is drawn from regions with moderate to high water stress. And this is creating strains on the communities where water is already scarce, and there's a growing concern as more places are facing drought and high temperatures due to climate change. We're also starting to see community pushback around water restrictions. So for example, in Chile, they recently halted a project with Google because of the drought conditions. Another example in Spain, there was a $1.1 billion Meta planned data center that was proposing to use 176 million gallons of water annually, and they put a pause on that project. In the US, we've seen farmers and community members protesting data center water usage, both in New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, Colorado, and Virginia. But also one of the main concerns here is that companies are now being found to be underestimating projected water consumption. So for example, Microsoft's giant data center in North Holland was projected to consume around 84 million liters of water during 2021, but they ended up consuming 20 million liters more than they had projected initially. So these are all issues around direct water usage, but indirect water usage is just as important, or if not more important. So according to researchers at Virginia Tech, roughly 3/4 of water usage attributed to data centers actually happens at indirect, at the site of electricity generation. So sometimes this power generation is happening in adjacent sites, in adjacent states or municipalities, which means that it's not only residents living next to data centers or in communities where data centers are located, but it's communities located in other geographies as well. And this, again, this is scope 2 water consumption, and this doesn't get at the scope 3 impacts from water, which refer to other sections of the tech supply chain. For example, semiconductor foundries are known to use a lot of water as well. There's just a lot of lack of transparency and a lack of like actually tracking these metrics in industry. So we need more of that. It's also important to note that it's not just water usage and consumption, but there are also growing concerns around impacts to water quality. So, for example, in Northern Virginia, the Occoquan Reservoir, which provides drinking water to 3 3 counties and over 2 million residents, has seen an alarming increase in concentrations of sodium and other salt-related constituents, and this is because it's been found to be related to the increase in impervious surfaces from data center development. So there's other concerns around how the development might also impact water sources and the longevity of the water quality of various different sources. Then there's a couple of industry terms that are important to pay attention to, which is water usage effectiveness and net water positive. So these terms can often obscure a lot of information. So water usage effectiveness is actually a measure that tries to track the water efficiency of data centers by measuring the amount of water used per unit of energy consumed. But it obscures a lot. It doesn't account for the water source. It also doesn't differentiate between potable or recycled water. And it focuses on a ratio of water usage related to energy. So if you ended up having old equipment and that meant you were using more energy as to water, it might obscure these facts. And similarly with net water positive, this doesn't pay attention to the water source. Next slide, please.
Okay, we need to move on to the next speaker, so
okay. All right. Well, there are various different industry solutions and plenty of places for research in this area. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay. Let's move on to land use considerations with Jim McElfish.
Yeah, Jim McElfish, Environmental Law Institute. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about local government regulation of land use, which in the United States is where most land use issues are addressed. Local governments are governments of limited powers in the U.S., and their powers are derived entirely from state law and state constitutions. Because of this, it's important to look at what states have reserved to themselves and what powers they have given local governments. So, for example, issues of air pollution are often reserved to the state environmental agency. Issues of water use, particularly water withdrawal from rivers, streams, or aquifers, often are within the competence of state governments, not local governments. So bearing in mind that local governments have limited powers, but are also the primary actor in deciding on where land uses occur and under what conditions they occur, look at a couple of the ways that this is applied to data centers. That the U.S. system largely is one where local governments engage in comprehensive planning. What's our goal for the future development? And typically, comprehensive planning cites particular areas of residential or mixed use or natural resource preservation or industrial or the like. The comprehensive plan is a guide, but it is not itself regulatory. So the regulatory measures are carried out in zoning ordinances, typically by maps and zoning districts, and the regulations that prescribe how many units you're allowed to have or how dense it can be or what sorts of uses are compatible with other uses. So when we get to data centers, obviously 10, 15 years ago, this was not an issue for local governments, but nevertheless, applications were occurring for these uses. So the initial question is, well, what kind of land use is a data center? These are often fairly large, buildings, 100,000 square feet, several 100,000 square feet. What is a data center like and where does it fit? Is it a commercial use? Well, if it's a commercial use, do we want it in a zone where we have retail development and office development? Well, it's not particularly compatible with some of those uses. No employees, a very large footprint, not something that would be conducive to a good streetscape or trying to develop sort of a mixed use area. Not great compatibility with transit, for example. So maybe it's an industrial use. And then, of course, we need to answer this question in our zoning ordinance because what it is also affects where it can be sited. Can it be sited at all? Is it okay in the agricultural area? Many of these are greenfields developments because they require large areas of land. They don't really necessarily want to be in a residential area. So do we just put it out in the agricultural zone? So choices for local governments. One of the other key things is what process applies when an application appears center within the zoning ordinance. If you've zoned an area and you've defined what it is, can it be approved by right? It's an administrative action of the zoning administrator. Or do we want to exercise greater control by designating it as a special exception, which requires more detail in the application and a legislative hearing by the county board or the township board or the like? Or is it by rezoning that, in effect, this is like planned area development or planned unit development, and each one is its own entity, which requires legislative approval? That also provides greater control to the municipality. Next slide, please. So the kinds of issues that arise with data centers that local governments are dealing with typically are the first one, which zoning districts can these be in? Are we going to define a data center zoning district? Or are we going to confine them to heavy industrial? Are we going to confine them to the warehouse district? Because they're a little bit like, warehouse facilities, not a lot of pedestrian traffic, kind of large buildings and the like. Building size, form, configuration. Is there a limit on how big they can be? Can they be single story? What form do they have? Is there a setback? Do they have to be, or do cooling units have to be 300, 500 feet from the property line? Require parking, since these rarely have few on-site employees, we can't just treat them like other commercial or industrial for parking minimums. Water, stormwater is particularly interesting. Very few municipalities have anything to say or any power over water use. As long as the applicant has a source of water, that's usually nothing that the local municipality is able to get into. Stormwater, on the other hand, they have a great deal to say about in terms of the configuration of facilities, parking lots, runoff, and the like. Ancillary support facilities are extremely important. Many of these facilities require backup generators, often run off of fossil fuels, often producing noise, and municipalities do have control over the siting and use of these. Typical issues of noise, lighting. There are architectural requirements too. Are these faceless warehouse-like buildings, or do we require something that makes it at least look like a public or office building of some kind? I mentioned energy largely because there's often not authority to deal with energy sources in local governments, but it's extremely important. Next slide, please. So I've highlighted a number of examples of really recent planning and zoning examples in Northern Virginia. Northern Virginia has over 300 data centers and more in the pipeline, and they've had to scramble to figure out where they're going to site them and have made a lot of changes. Most recently, Fairfax County has revised its zoning ordinance. It's changed which districts centers can be located in. It's instituted requirements for screening and enclosure of the venting and cooling systems. It's also limited the by right development of future data centers. So if you're 40,000 square feet or less in a commercial district or 80,000 or less in industrial zone, then you can go through the by right permit process. Otherwise, you need to submit to a special exception, which requires greater levels of review by the county governing body. Interesting thing in the new zoning ordinance, no more new data centers, new applications will be approved within 1 mile from entrances to metro stations. Why is this important? Well, you want your development to be concentrated in metro stations where people live, where people work, where people are doing commercial things. And if you're plopping down a data center which has few employees and no foot traffic and is not synergistic with other things, you don't want to waste your transit areas on that. Prince William County and other large counties instituted data center overlay districts in 2016. They have revised their ordinances several times, including most recently changing the noise regulations to apply over a 24-hour period and not just at night in the case of data centers. Loudoun County has pending amendments to its comprehensive plan. Loudoun County has over 40 million square feet of data centers with over 40 million square feet of applications already in the pipeline. So 90 million square feet of data centers already known or pending in Loudoun. It would change their approach to make all data centers a special exception review rather than by right, where it's allowed. And they have put in the comprehensive plan amendments, if adopted, they don't support new data centers in the urban transit center areas. Unfortunately, almost all the current data centers and the pending applications are in the urban transit centers. So Loudoun County is a little late in coming to trying to control development of the data centers in areas which are important for mass transit. Finally, I want to mention Chandler, Arizona. Of course, this is one of the areas with great deal of data centers and also water constraints. They revised their ordinance last December to limit data centers only to a specific plan unit development area. And they have new requirements on noise and backup generator testing limits. One of the things that's happened is that by requiring a legislative hearing for new data centers, Chandler has actually been able to affect water use. So a new data center that was approved this summer agreed to retrofit an existing data center already in Chandler to get off the water cooling system and go to a more modern air cooling system. And so Chandler essentially leveraged its approval process to change the cooling approaches, something which it had not had the power to do directly. Things to watch: Virginia Legislative Audit Review Commission has a study which should be out this month examining impacts of data centers in Virginia. Watch this space. And finally, a couple of other resources. The Piedmont Environmental Council, an environmental organization in Northern Virginia, has a interactive map on their website for data centers throughout Virginia. And the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality has just rolled out a new website with all of the air emissions permits pending and issued for data centers in Virginia. So lots to catch up with, and I turn the balance of my time over to the next panelist.
Great. Thank you very much, Jim. So Tim, take it away.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the Environmental Law Institute for being here. I'd like to thank everyone who's participating in this or for hosting this. And I'd like to everyone who's here to learn more about this. This is a huge issue. And also I'd like to thank ELI for saying I'm an expert. Don't get that a lot in my line of work because I'm generally just a climate activist and public advocate in state legislatures and communities. So I'll do my best to keep up with the rest of the prestigious panelists here. I don't have slides. Northern Virginia, we talked about this. Virginia is the capital of was the data center capital of the world. And so I think my contributions to this discussion is talking about what all of this looks like in real time, because since we have the greatest data center burden, we can paint a picture of what the worst case scenario looks like, and oftentimes what reckless data center development looks like. We've discussed this a little bit before on this panel already. It's not uniformity in data centers. You can have a data center in Arizona that's going to look very different than a data center in Virginia. So let's paint the landscape a little bit of why we're concerned and why Virginia is really the staging ground for how we should be able to develop policy that is responsible data center development or data center pausing, or what it looks like if we don't do anything to create some safeguards, not just for our globe in terms of climate change, but also in terms of how we can protect people's livelihoods from this growth. So Virginia, we talked, as we mentioned, we already have over 57 million square feet of constructed or operational data center growth. And we have another, nearly 2 million square feet proposed. And that proposals, by the way, are not slowing down. Just in the last 3 weeks, we know of at least 5 new data center proposals. That's how large scale this is. That's the equivalent of 1,000 Walmart supercenters that are plaguing a lot of different communities who have to deal with the burdens that come with data center development. The other side of this is energy. I won't exhaust this because it's been talked about, but 25% of Virginia's electricity is consumed by data centers right now. 25%. That is the most of any state in the United States. It's any state. In fact, there's more data centers in Virginia than anywhere else in the world. The only place that has more data centers than the state of Virginia is the country of China. That is a mind-boggling statistic when you think about it. So if anyone knows what the worst case scenarios look like that in terms of data center development, it is the Commonwealth that I live in. Why are they so bad in terms of the energy side? Well, they're being used as an excuse to build a fleet of new fossil fuel plants. Energy has to come from somewhere. And the cheat code by the industry and utilities generally is natural gas. We know that the UN and 90+% of the scientific community says the one thing we have to do is stop and mitigate methane. Data centers are now being used as the example for continuing to keep natural gas and coal plants online, as well as create new infrastructure. We mentioned the integrated resource plans. Dominion Energy, our largest utility, they've dropped theirs over the last month. They have a new fleet of natural gas pipelines, and they say it's pretty much exclusively because we have to find power for data centers. That is doubling our electricity demand output. Doubling our demand means we have to put the power from somewhere. And the industry and utilities say that it can't be done with clean energy. Now, whether or not that's true is another situation, but that's what they're proposing. You cannot have data center development in its current stage and climate solutions at the same time. They cannot coexist. Now let's look at what that looks like for us, just as the ratepayers, as people just trying to live happy lives. 29% of Virginians in 2023 said that they had to forego basic goods so they could afford their electric bill. Keep the heat on in the winter, but it would do so, I have to sacrifice buying as much groceries as we have, getting gas in the car to go to work, buying medicine, taking your kids to school. That's the reality of what it looks like. Dominion Energy says they're going to likely triple our bills in order to pay for the power development that we'll use to explicitly power data centers. That's what we're looking at. Now that's one type of harm. It's just the financial cost of data center development. The second side of it, of course, is the pollution that comes with it. Laura did a great job of talking about the water. We can talk about how some of these things are taking from potable water sources, drinking sources. In Northern Virginia alone, it's up by 250%, which means some of the localities who are pretty much the sole purveyors of the proliferation of data centers, they might be put in a position where they have to choose between giving drinking water sources to a data center, like they have in Caroline County, for example. There's an AI data center campus by Amazon that's being proposed. That one part of that campus has been approved, it will require 378,000 gallons of water per day to operate. Caroline County and surrounding counties are in the middle of a drought. What happens if that gets worse? Were they going to have to choose to be powering or making sure that the operations of a really big revenue source is able to operate, or are they going to go to homes, businesses, and families? That's a precarious position that they found themselves in. The other side of it is diesel generation. Take out the power plants for a second. Let's just talk about diesel generation. Every proposed data center in Virginia has diesel generation for emergency power. They say it's for emergency power, but these things have to operate throughout the week. In fact, there's a permit for the Department of Environmental Quality that says they get a permit to operate from 9 to 5 every day, except for the weekends. So it's not just emergency power, it's the maintenance costs. They run periodically. Toxic chemicals from diesel generation with concentrations of 30, 40, 50, sometimes on site. Those release arsenic, benzene, NOx, things that cause cancer, things that cause chronic respiratory illness. In Northern Virginia, there is 4,000 diesel generators on site around the data centers there alone. If there is a blackout, those things running at the same time, I can't even contemplate what that effect will be on the surrounding communities. And we have no protections in the sense because when they approve these data centers, there's no look at the cumulative impact of each site. So it doesn't matter that there's 50 diesel generators over here. We're not going to include that in the analysis of whether these generators should be put here. That's what the regulatory framework allows. Some of these data centers can be located literally within 200 feet of a neighborhood. In Fairfax County, I went to a press conference about one that was, you could see where the site was going to be, and it was a stone's throw from people's houses. So on-site pollution, the energy demand increasing our rate-paying bills, that's the issues that we're focusing on. And then lastly, like I said before, the excuse to build new fossil fuel plants, those are going to be located in environmental justice areas. Dominion Energy has now proposed a giant natural gas fired power plant in a place called Chesterfield County, which is a place that has already dealt with 80 years of pollution from a coal plant that was operating all the time. That area also is the 90th percentile for cancer, meaning they're 90%, that they have higher cancer rates than 90% of the country. We're intensifying pollution in those areas, and it's done because, according to utilities, of data center growth. There's mention of the bring your own power proposal, which I love that idea because it lessens the burden on ratepayers. But in Louisiana, I just got off the phone with a Bloomberg reporter just yesterday. Louisiana, Meta has proposed a $10 billion, 4 million square foot data center that will be powered by natural gas. That's going to hurt our climate, and it's also going to hurt the communities around them. I just see this as something that is extremely reckless, and it becomes a binary choice. We talked about research questions here of whether or not, of how we're going to do this, of how we're going to power these things with clean energy, how we're going to answer the question is if we can do data center development and solve our climate crisis, how, without even stopping to ask if we should. That's the stake on a global level. And by the way, 1.5 billion in tax incentive is given to the tech industry in Virginia. This is the operational landscape. They come into a locality that's ill-equipped to look at the cumulative impact. They buy land and they say, we're going to build it on for it and you're going to have revenue. And don't worry about everything else over here. Just look over here. You want money for your schools? Great. Here's the solution. They don't talk about how much water it's going to use, how much energy it's going to use, and how much pollution it's going to cost. Because these are rich industries who are racing for AI, and they're not caring about how many people they have to trample to get there.
Hey, Tim, can we wrap it up
Yeah,
so we can start to move?
absolutely. I heard the bell. So go ahead.
Thanks. All right. Well, thank you all for setting the stage here. We've got lots of activity in the webinar chat. I thought I'd ask one question. There's been already comments about the backup generation and the use of diesel fuel, and perhaps Professor Stein or Jim could talk about what regulatory apparatus is there to deal with the emissions from those the backup generators.
So I would have to look specifically at each individual state, but I know that for most places, it would probably count as emergency backup and not be always regulated under their current air emissions modeling. So there's a different category for emergency backup types.
So they would essentially be exempt from any
Not
emission
from any,
permits?
they're just regulated differently, but it's very specific to jurisdiction.
Jim, anything here you want to say about that?
Um, it's an area where state permitting should apply, and where local governments have typically fairly limited power. The local governments often are limited to indicating where backup generators can occur, or what the soundscape might be, or enclosure. I think one of the Northern Virginia ordinances requires backup generation to be located behind or within the main building. The idea being to prevent the most immediate noise and pollution impacts. But the direct controls are going to be primarily the state air pollution agency.
So, and I just looked up quickly, like, for example, this is in Wisconsin, and they approved a 1.3 million square foot data center with 40 emergency electric generators. And it says that as backup power, they're expected to run only for testing and emergencies, and they're permitted to produce just under 100 tons of NOx emissions each year. So they're regulated, but in different ways. And you'd have to look specifically to your local regulations.
I can
Okay.
jump in about Northern Virginia. I believe that the backup diesel generators are allowed to run 500 hours a year. And there was a proposal back in 2023 when Dominion was expected to reach capacity, that I think, Tim, we've spoken about this previously. You were part of the community effort leading to push back on this proposal, but the DOE proposed relaxing the diesel emission regulations in Virginia. That issue got tabled at the time because of the great work of community organizing, but I expect it'll come back around.
So do those emissions play a role in, is there any attention to cumulative emissions in the state air pollution regulations?
No. So the Department of Environmental Quality looks at things in an isolated sense. So everything's siloed out. So, and this is true for fossil fuel pollution as well. If they want to have a proposal, they only look at that impact as if pollution just stays in one place. Same is true for diesel generation. They have to apply for a permit, but the permit does not include cumulative impact in the surrounding areas.
Okay, great.
And
So Lauren, there's been a lot of interest in your presentation in the chat. I'm having a hard time listening to all of you and watching the chat at the same time. It's really quite active. But can you say more about specifically the local impacts, water impacts?
I mean, so the local impacts vary depending on the locality, depending on the climate, depending on the type of data center. But essentially, as I outlined, there are various different forms of impacts. There's impacts from water consumption at the site. There's also impacts to the water quality. There's impacts at the site of electricity generation. So it really depends on like what locality you're talking about within this tech supply chain, and at what moment in time and in what season. But really, there's just deep concerns about the lack of transparency and the lack of reporting. So one part I didn't get to was there's a proposal coming up in the 2025 legislative session by Danica Roem to look at to make data center operators report on their water usage. I have some concerns about what they will actually be reporting, if they'll be reporting, for example, WE, the water usage effectiveness, versus consumption, if they're going to be looking at the sources that they're drawing from, But yeah, I think that these kinds of proposals, these kinds of policies, we're going to see more of them as as the development spreads out across the United States, and there needs to be more transparency.
Yeah, I just want to add on to that because I study industry talking points and we engage with stakeholders all the time. We want to have these conversations with them. There is a bit of some of industry decouples water usage from cooling towers. They'll say, well, it'll be liquid cooling versus direct source cooling, which I know Lauren can speak more to, but they will separate that out in the policy end because definitions are important when it comes to regulations. Definitions are important when it comes to legislation. So there's liquid cooling towers, what they don't necessarily considering is direct source water consumption. So I just think that that's an important thing to point out.
So can any of you say something about the regulation that applies to water usage? Is it typically state level, or is it also local, or is this yet another instance of it varies?
I feel like, Jim, you might have the best answer on this.
I would say it varies, but water usage is largely controlled by state law rather than left to municipalities. Municipalities often, if the applicant says, "Hey, we get our water from the public water supplier," and the water supplier says we're providing it, that's the end of the story, unless there's a state law providing otherwise in terms of efficiency or usage. In areas of limited water supply, state laws can and do play a role, and particularly Western U.S. where there are water withdrawal provisions where you actually need water rights. They're tracked or monitored, but not necessarily limited.
I think one area that could be interesting here is how municipalities and local governments could require reporting as a part of their application process. So there might be other ways to intervene, even though essentially, the state will control the water regulation.
Okay. Are there questions or comments that any of you would like to pose to the other panelists?
Yeah, I had a question that I was looking through the chat to see, some of the questions that were coming up that folks are talking about. And a lot of it came around like building really close, what we call setback requirements for how close you can build to certain types of buildings and facilities like schools, residential areas and communities. I think that was a big theme in the chat. And I was just wondering for folks that you've thought about that, as I've engaged from the DOE with various state, local community officials, this is a big challenge that they're thinking about of where do we actually site data centers? And it's a different answer for each county and each community. So wondering in your experiences, like doing this work, what's like the right framework to think about this? Because obviously it's not a one size fits all.
I don't want to, I'm happy for others to jump in, but I'd be happy to talk about what happened in Prince William County. Jim, you mentioned the overlay, the overlay district. So I know that was a community-led effort to come up. It actually came out of a transmission line dispute over an Amazon data center, I think in 2016. I'm not sure if I'm remembering correctly, but after a long community dispute, community leaders and Dominion Energy and policymakers sat down and said, okay, so how do we avoid this again? Let's find an area that we think data centers should go in. And they outlined a 10,000 acre area in Prince William County and said, this seems like a good site. It's already zoned for industrial. It's got brownfield and some greenfield sites. And essentially since then, so many of the applications have been outside the overlay district to the point that, people in the community are like, why did we bother going through this process and sitting down and developing and outlining this particular space that's good for data center development when all of the applications are just coming in all over the place and being approved, with comprehensive plan amendments. So I think that's a pertinent question, a really important one. but I also think the level of demand is making it more challenging for both policymakers and community members to find these spaces. And it's often also cheaper. The land is often cheaper outside these industrial zoned areas.
And the tax advantages to municipalities are pretty great, because typically these demand very few municipal services. There aren't school children. Essentially, this is a use which can be a cash cow in the real estate market. So yeah, even if you have a plan or zoning ordinance, there's nothing to prevent someone from coming in and requesting an amendment, and Lauren has laid out exactly how that can occur.
Okay, let me switch gears just a little bit. I've gotten some questions about the Energy Permitting Reform Act of 2024 and what your views are on that. Is anyone prepared to make some comments about that?
Well,
Oh,
go ahead.
Amy, go ahead. You go.
I mean, it has not been an area of my focus. I just know that it has, it's a massive proposal with lots of different things, from, judicial review that allows individuals and groups to legally challenge federal actions, and has a lot of things that a lot of people are excited about, like Department of Interior will hold lease sales for various energy resources on federal lands at different time intervals. It requires Interior to set a goal for permitting renewable energy on federal land. But there's a lot of concern as well about, they have so many things in it that it has something basically for everyone to be upset and happy about. And people are worried about there's a real conflict between trying to streamline our current, permitting processes, which just we have stalled our transmission infrastructure development in large part because of that, because of the way transmission siting works in our country. Each state gets a decision about it. And so one state could block a multi-state transmission line. It's not a federal siting process for transmission lines. And so people get very frustrated by that. But at the same time, people get very frustrated by eminent domain, which allows you to just plow through a transmission line somewhere where you don't want it. So we as a nation really have to struggle with these problems and, decide how we're going to balance all these different priorities. I mentioned the self-supply idea, because those of us who have solar panels on our roofs, we know about distributed generation and this idea that if we generate on site, maybe we can avoid a lot of the transmission costs, because it is expensive. So this is why it's very intriguing to me, this idea about co-locating, where a data center wants to come onto a nuclear plant's place. And, are they really taking advantage, though, of still the transmission line resources? And are they truly going to function as a microgrid? So these are really big, deep questions that I'm not sure we have, great answers to yet. But I would encourage, I think, Reed, you had asked us to areas of further research. We definitely need more thinking about this.
So let me follow up on that and say, there's a difference between saying we need to know about some things and saying we specifically need research on things. If you had a large pot of money that you could dispense for research projects, what would they be with relating to local impacts of data centers?
I mean, I would appreciate just an analysis of the revenue of how much it would cost them to foot the bill for these things. Because right now, Virginia is footing the bill for the world's internet access. The transmission lines that we're talking about in the context of this Energy Permitting Reform Act, unfortunately, make it easier also to fast track fossil fuel projects. The transmission lines aspect of that, most of the transmission lines in our regional grid are being used for the specific purpose to power data centers. Now, I just think in basic issues of fairness, you have the most money, you're also the responsible for the demand, you pay for it. I want something, I pay for it. That's how it works for normal people. That's how it works for families. Why do industries get the exception? Why do we have to pick up the tab for them? So how do we format and build out these things in an equitable way? Is not just a qualitative question, it is a quantitative one, because there has to be an analysis of how to do a least cost scenario for ratepayers. And right now, we don't really have that. All the projections and studies that do exist show across the United States a 25% to a 70% increase in our electric bills. Data center industry in the United States is projected to make $100 billion in revenue every year. So when I hear we can't do things like clean energy projects, or we don't want to pay for transmission lines, I hear someone who just wants to save a buck, who absolutely could afford it.
So you want to know how much would it actually cost to meet some of these environmental goals?
Yeah.
Other
Way
research,
to make it concise.
other research projects that you would suggest, any of the other panelists?
I would love to see better quantification of trying to connect the dots between energy usage and specific types of use in the data centers. I found it difficult. Like, people seem to either, attack AI, and every data center is about AI, whereas a lot of data centers are about all of us keeping our pictures in the cloud. And I mean, we all sort of use a data center behind the scenes. They've just gotten increased proportions with the idea of hyperscalers and AI and crypto and the rest. And so I found it hard to differentiate unless it's an AI dedicated data center. I found it hard to find, like, okay, how much of this data center is being used for specific purposes? And that, I think, could get tied in, Tim, to what you're thinking about, because, some of we benefit from data centers too. So I would love more data there.
Yeah, and kind of in a similar vein, I think understanding a little bit more about incentive structures we could for flexible loads. So piggyback off of that comment around what's happening in the data center, specifically in one of the two things that people are trying to balance in the industry are the speed to build that next, generation of AI models and being first to market, with how much it costs to potentially be flexible with when it's better priced on the grid, or with maybe a certain generation source that's not, consistent 24/7. So there's a lot of opportunities if we can create an incentive structure to delay or to defer some of the work happening in data centers to a different time. And if we can find, we have to understand how the shape of that load looks like and the shape of that work looks like. We need to also create a financial incentive structure, so then people are willing, for some clients of data centers, and then the data centers developers themselves, when they make those contracts for how they sell power and compute in their data center, that they're keeping it in mind where there's an incentive for the client to say, actually, I'll pay me, I'll pay a little bit less if you defer me to a better time for the grid.
I think there's a really interesting point that both of you brought up. One is the incentive structures. I'm a little skeptical of incentive structures working, because already there's a bunch of incentives that exist. I mean, the Biden administration is giving $40 billion to invest in nuclear. We've mentioned there's $1.5 billion in tax incentives for Virginia. I think they're already getting things enough. I think it's more of a stick, less than a carrot situation. Is you can't get these incentives if you don't uphold climate goals. Because put this all in perspective, data center development is being used alongside fossil fuel development. We can't solve the climate crisis without fossil fuels development. So I think it would be, again, we're talking about research questions. How do we develop data centers, particularly AI data centers, which are energy hogs, in a way that does not sacrifice climate goals and doesn't rely on energy that comes with the trade-off of making people sick? I think that should be the framework of the question, because if policy is more about placating to the industry and seeing how we can get them to play ball, instead of saying, you have to play by our rules, that's what government's for. We set the rules of what you can play. Then we put ourselves in a position where we're set up to fail. In my 10 years plus of working in legislative advocacy, it seems like taking something away that already exists is more effective than saying you could also get this. In my opinion.
So then, to turn it in away from an activist framing to, should I say, research or nerds perspective, the question, one thing to look at would be the relative efficacy of incentives versus, mandates along these lines in this context.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. What do regulations look like? And by the way, regulations are alongside economic growth, not downfall. That's a misnomer. Every study confirms this. So regulations means rules. You can't get something if you do that. I think that framework of what a policy framework, and that's what we're missing. The guidebook that Pranava, like that's exactly what I'm looking at. I just think the foundation should be all encompassing, as you mentioned, Reed, not just one or the other.
Yeah.
The U.S. national, go ahead, Lauren, please.
Just to piggyback of what Tim has already laid out, I want to highlight something that Tim brought up previously, which is also that currently we're not looking at the cumulative impacts. We're looking at a site-by-site situation. EIR statements are just at one site, and this is just a huge flaw. So it means it's really difficult for local policymakers to be making informed decision on a case-by-case basis. So what I would love to see, and I think about this question a lot, if I had all of the money in the world to run research around this, we need to be looking at, well, we need to first have an account of all of the proposals happening in all different locations, what all of the local resources are, what the spatial implications are, what the related infrastructure implications are, and it needs to be modeled out, and it needs to be cumulative. So there's a lot of work to be done, and I think it's an area that needs collaboration across different fields. This panel is just a great example of how that could look. Yeah, but I think that we need to be paying attention to even what is already currently being approved and in development to be able to understand what could be coming down the pike in the future.
Yeah.
I would say too that emphasis on state experiences and information that's relevant to state legislatures is going to be key, because a lot of the sticks as well as the incentives lie in the hands of the state legislatures in terms of cumulative impacts of air permitting, of siting powers, of utility regulation in many instances, and greenhouse gas goals. So something on the policy side that is not just federal and not just how do we incentivize industry.
Yeah, and I was just going to add that I think you should all pay attention to what Pranava mentioned. He's going to focus, I think, right, on sort of rate structures and things. And I think there's a lot of creativity that can happen that can help. I mean, I don't know if any of you are following AEP's, recent settlement that they filed with the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission, and it requires these new large load customers to make these long-term financial commitments to ensure that they're paying the cost, per Tim's point and Lauren's concerns. I mean, this is something that everybody cares about, but I think like that's a success story in some ways, hopefully, for like the big tech got together with the Citizens Action Coalition of Indiana, with the utility, with the, the Office of the Utility Consumer Counselor, and they reached this agreement, and they're trying to find creative ways to kind of get them to put their money behind their mouth, right? Like put the money on the table. If you want us to build for you, then you're in this for 10 years. And there was a long history in this country of sunk costs with building nuclear plants. We thought they were going to be too cheap to meter, and then there was all this litigation over who's supposed to, bear the burden now when we never completed it. And so in the law, we have things like the prudent investment rule. And, I keep thinking, as Lauren does, these things keep me up at night. Like I think of myself in 10 years, are we all going to agree these were prudent investments when they were made today? And there are competing rules, of course, as well. But I think that would be something to keep an eye on because it's really interesting. And for, everyone who wants also funds for the community, I think they got like $500,000 annually for to support low income, electricity customers in Indiana. So, it's not going to be perfect, but it's an example of how maybe everybody has to kind of give a little to work to try to create something that could be at least feasible and legally binding for these companies.
So
The last one I might add
Okay,
there, Reed, is
please.
like also just an economic impact analysis, like focusing on redeveloping like retiring coal assets as one example. There's a lot of opportunities of transitioning from coal to nuclear or coal to solar with storage. There's a lot of those opportunities. I think when we've talked to data center developers and we've talked to state and local officials, one of the like the big question is how many jobs are actually coming to this particular community for this? And so there's I think an agreement that there's lots of construction jobs, but then once the site is built long term, how many jobs are actually coming from that site? I think we're not all on the same page about what that economic impact actually looks like. So I'd love to see more research in that area too. And we're thinking about it as well.
Okay. It's been pointed out to me that there's lots of comments and questions about the use of nuclear energy to support data center activity. And I would be interested in, I think our audience would be interested in hearing your take on that. Especially, again, keeping it with a focus on the local local impacts?
Well, Pranava probably can answer this. It's my understanding, and this is, multiple organizations, including us, have been concerned about the promise of small modular reactors being the silver bullet for data centers. So, minimized version of a nuclear plant that has been proven in a lab, but has never gone to scale in the United States. They had an abandoned project in South Carolina in 2007. They've been looking at expansions of nuclear through SMRs, as they call them, for a while. And again, if it's from a utility structure, they can build them, well, at least in Virginia, they can build them. And even if it doesn't have any power output, the cost recovery still falls onto the ratepayer. And that's very similar across the United States. It seems to me that it is experimental, which in one ways, I love American ingenuity and I want to reach for the stars, but I don't think the risk should be passed on to customers if it doesn't provide any power. You're mentioning research questions. This would be an interesting thing, is like even the power demand we are looking at, small modular reactors won't reach that, not alone. So what is the viability of small modular reactors? I'm skeptical of, but what I'm really perturbed by is that ratepayers might have to pay for a failed project. So that's, I think, is important in this conversation. And then, of course, from an environmental standpoint, there is waste with nuclear reactors. Where does that waste go? It goes into low-income communities. It goes into communities of color. And in fairness, that's just not right.
Let me, I'm watching the clock here. We're going to be winding up soon. So first, I just want to mention that we're going to put in the chat a link to a survey, and we'd appreciate your feedback on this webinar and also what you'd like to see in the future. And also a link to the website of the Network for the Digital Economy and the Environment, where we will soon be posting a recording of this and the slides. But let me try and wrap up with one question, which is a very difficult one. What do you think is the most politically effective policy pathway for dealing with these problems? We can be policy analysts and talk about how in theory, what's the most effective policy, but obviously we live in a political world. Among the different ways of addressing some of the concerns that have been described here, what are the ones that are most politically viable?
I think that we actually are going to see streamlining of permitting coming in the next few years. I think that is one, and Tim's right. It's streamlining for everybody, right? It's not going to be streamlining all specific to certain types of energy. And politically and realistically, I don't think that's going to happen. But that's something I see happening. It's also, and it goes back to the nuclear question. It's a very interesting one because, nuclear has always caused divides within the environmental communities, and it's a carbon-free resource, but yes, it also, we have, Yucca Mountain is just a little saga and a blip in the history of how we still don't have anywhere to put our permanent high-level nuclear waste. Not to mention we still would have to mine for the uranium, right? It's not quite a renewable, but it counts if with these big tech and to try to achieve their carbon goals. And so I think we're going to see some movement on nuclear, and I think it might not just be in the SMRs that Tim and I were talking about. I think it's going to be in the creativity of trying, like the TMI restart, like finding plants that are already existing, so you could avoid the $36 billion construction costs, but maybe were shut down for economic reasons and could now be restarted for, as long as they pass the Nuclear Regulatory Commission safety reasons, they can restart their licenses. So that would be, I think, two realistic things that I could see.
Pranava, thank you for putting that link in the chat for people who want to know more about small modular reactors. I think
just adding on the other kind of policy question, I think, +1 to permitting reform. I think in general, a big challenge we have is just building more infrastructure more quickly. Even independent of data centers, we need that in this country across many communities and across many regions. So part of that is permitting reform. Part of that is different tariff designs, other innovative structures where we can incentivize certain types of build outs, which are just not super possible in the current regulatory environment. So we need a lot more thinking in those spaces. I would say also just definitely more, I would say, I'm just speaking from the federal level, but also like more coordination. And this is not necessarily policy, but more coordination between all the parties, like both regional, state parties, developers, utilities, public utilities commissions, communities, and federal entities to come together to brainstorm all these options. There's many levers to pull to build well and with community in mind, but they're easier when you have a particular site in a particular region. So it really requires bringing a lot of people to the table on that. So I'd love to see more of that.
Well, thank you all very much. I really appreciate your time and your thoughts, and the more than 300 people who tuned in. I hope they liked it as well. And let me just reiterate that we are going to be posting a recording and the slides on the NDE website. Just look in your, in the chat for the link, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.
Thanks all.